I'm Blaze from Blaze Faith Apparel, and today I am here to show you how to make the shirred bustier crop top. It's got shirred sleeves, a nice shirred back, and let me just show you a little bit, all fitted around the front, and you can have it off the shoulder as well, which is really nice, which looks quite elegant, I think, a bit princessy. It's a pattern that I've designed myself, and it's available on my Etsy shop, or it's actually also available especially for Christmas in a print. And when you have it printed, you get all the booklets and everything ready in there, but you also have the brilliant version of downloading your pattern straight away, and it goes from UK size 6 to 18 or US size, never remember, 2 to 14. I've put on here as well, if you want to print just your size or two sizes if you're in between and you want to adjust your pattern, you can download Acrobat Adobe, and it's free, so you just download it through Creative Cloud, and it's fantastic because it means that you can select sizes. So if you go into layers, you can select which ones you want. So keep the top and bottom layers visible because that's how you've got your key, your instructions and all the markings on it, but patterns in between, you can select which ones you want, which ones you don't. When you go to print your pattern, make sure that the scale is ticked and it's marked as 100%. That means that your printer will print exactly what I've put on there, so it's not going to try and size anything up or down, because that's when you start to have issues. And on the second page of your pattern, when you've printed it out, it's got a 5cm box all the way around, so if you measure that, make sure it's spot on, and don't worry if you have any issues, feel free to message me. The best place is Blaze Faith Apparel on Instagram, message me through there, or if you've bought a product through Etsy, then feel free to message me on there as well. Any way that you feel comfortable with, I'm happy, or YouTube, down in the comments, whatever you like. I'm happy to hear from you, I'm really happy to help, so it's no worry whatsoever. And once you printed it all, you have to tape them all together. I'm going to do a separate video on how to do it. It's very simple, it's the same for most PDF patterns. And this is how your pattern will be printed out if you decide to print. And it's got all the information in there you need. So it's got the printing information, the Acrobat information for how to change the layers and anything if you need to do any of that. And if you look inside, we've got the what you need, fabric options, size chart, body measurement. I've even got a fabric options page that just gives you an idea of some of the ones that you can use and what they are. If you're relatively new to sewing and you're not sure what fabrics are what, feel free to reach out and message me. Here we go, and here's a quick glimpse at your instructions. You've got all the illustrations with the step-by-steps in there. There is 42 steps to this. And I've also got a page here that explains shirring step by step, so I'll also put up another video on this as well so that you can watch a bit more of an in-depth one. The shirring of this cuff, I believe it took 20 minutes for one cuff, so the recording's obviously sped up quite a bit so that you don't have to sit through the 20 minutes of me doing that, which I think you'll be grateful for. It takes quite a long time. So if you've never done it before, or it's been a while since you've done it, you should have enough information in this video, but if you're uncertain, please check out my other one because it might be helpful to watch it a little bit more in depth. It took 20 minutes for me to shear just this cuff, so it's obviously sped up a lot so that you don't have to watch the whole thing. But yeah, so feel free to check that out. This is available on my Etsy shop as a digital download. So you print it off in A4 pages and you stick it all together. So you've got these markings here where you mark them together. And then all the way along the top of the pages there is these numbers. So this is B4 and B3. The pages you get will be from A1 to A4, so there's only 4 pages along, and it goes down to D. So A1, A2, A3, A4, B1, B2, B3, B4, and they match together. When you get to the Ds, there's no D1 because it would be a blank page. So to save you having to print out a page with the markings and everything on, and for it to pull through an extra piece of paper, that just won't be printed. So that's visible in the lay plan. I've got another one of these that I've made, and I've made it with a shirred fabric on top of a polyester lining. Polyester lining isn't a stretch one anyway, it's It's a nice structured one. It's almost bridal. I'll give you a quick glimpse. I've got it over here. Here we go. It's lovely. So you've got the nice opaque sleeves, and the cuff here is all, it's opaque, so it looks so pretty when you've got it on. If you wanted to use this sort of fabric, it's lovely, and it works really, really, really well. All you have to do is the sections that you don't want to be see-through, you cut out 2 lots. So the top opaque fabric that you've got along with the lining, and you baste stitch those together and treat them like one piece then, and then you can start with my pattern from the beginning. And it's the same process all the way through. So it just depends on what look you're going for. Yeah, so if you measure yourself up, in the instructions you've got a sizing chart here. So measure yourself up and decide which one you want to go for. You can cut out your pattern pieces. If you're in between sizes, you can work with the pattern and print off the sizes that you need. This is on Adobe Acrobat as well. You can select those sizes, remember, so you don't have to print out everything unless you want to, so that you've got them for reference. And now we've gone through all the instructions, it's time to get to the sewing, and you can sew along with me. I hope you enjoy it. Now, firstly, set off and cut out all of your pattern pieces. In the PDF document that I send you, you can get all the individual sizes, so you don't have to worry about cutting out everything, and it's good because it saves a lot of paper. Really, the only thing that we need to mark here is this marking here that goes down 9 centimeters. This matches the arm sleeve and also the dart measurements, so that you don't have to keep referring back to the pattern pieces. So to mark these, get a tailor's chalk or water erasable pen. Now head over to your overlocker or use a zigzag stitch to overlock this edge here. It's a 0.5 centimeter seam, and then use your iron to press the overlocked edge inwards. So here I'm just showing you a very quick example of what I mean in the next section when I say stitch in the ditch, which is basically stitching inside the crease that you've made with the iron. Next stitch we are doing is a gathered stitch, so make sure you set your sewing machine to the longest setting and don't back stitch at either end. And now we are going to stitch in the ditch. Make sure you don't back stitch, as you need the open threads, and stitch all around the curved edge until you get to the end of the curve and keep the threads long. Here you can see how we've got the nice curved effect that we were after, and these here are the 2 threads that we need. You hold one end still and you pull the other, which gives a nice gathered effect. Now we're just going to press it flat and press the 0.5 centimeter seam back in like we did before, and now take one of those threads and pull up and ease onto the top. Doesn't have to be too much, it's only so that you can force the hem to lie flat when you turn it over in the next step. Now, with the extra ease that you have from the gathering, start folding over the edge 1.2 centimeters, and this is going to hold your elastic in place. Make sure you use lots of pins. This bit always takes a little bit of time, so you just need to have a little bit of patience as well. I know it's probably not the funnest thing to watch, but we're nearly done. Place your needle as close to the left side as you can and stitch all the way around. Attach a safety pin to one end of your elastic, and this will be threaded through the seam. And you will use the other safety pin to attach the other end so it doesn't pull through. and secure both ends of the elastic with a safety pin. Here we're going to zigzag stitch the elastic in place just below the line of stitching we did to make the seam. Make sure you back stitch just to make sure the elastic doesn't come away. Now fold over the arm pieces, and those two markings that we made at the very beginning, we are going to stitch from that marking there all the way to the bottom with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. And just finish it off with your overlock stitch or zigzag stitch. Now get your pattern piece 4 ready, and there will be 2 of these. We are going to fold them in half, press down and pin in place. Using a 1 centimetre seam allowance, stitch your seam in place and finish the raw edge with your overlocker. Now press the seam allowance you've just overlocked to one side. And now we are going to top stitch that seam that you have pressed to the side. Just make sure as you go along that you're as close to the edge as you can get, and that you're not catching the bottom layer of the cuff on the sewing machine. So here I'm just pulling it up to make sure that I'm not catching anything. And this is how your top stitching should look. Now turn your cuff inside out and fold up the raw edge of the hem 0.5 centimeters and press, then another 1 centimeter, making up a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Now stitch the cuff hem in place as close as you can to the edge. Now here's your top and bottom part of the sleeve, and we need the top section of the sleeve here to be gathered down to fit perfectly inside the cuff. To do this we need a long stitch on the sewing machine, and we're just going to do a gathering stitch all the way around this section here, and we're going to pull and gather it to fit inside. And with our stitch set to the longest setting, we are going to start our gathering stitch. Remember at the beginning and end of the stitch not to back stitch, as we need the threads to be long. Now when you put your two elements of the sleeve together, you can see how the top edge of the sleeve fits a lot better to the cuff edge. You might need to gather a little bit more or take some away to make sure it fits perfectly. Turn the cuff inside out because you're going to pin them right sides together. The first bit that you're going to match together is the seams that you top stitched previously. So matching these together makes for a much more professional finish once everything's done. The next section to pin in place is the opposite side. So if you fold in half both the cuff and the top of the sleeve, you can find the centre pieces. Pin this part in place, and then it makes it a lot easier for you to sort out the gathers in between the other two sides. Now make sure that you use lots of pins for this because the gathers will move out of place quite a bit. And don't worry about the gathering thread stitch. If any of that's overlapping, once you finish this seam, then we can pick that out after. Now, using a 1 cm seam allowance, stitch everything in place, making sure that the gathers stay nice and neat as you go along. Trim away any threads that are hanging over, and turning it right sides together, press the seam that you have just stitched down towards the cuff. So the next step, we are going to top stitch this seam in place, top stitching on the side of the cuff so that all of the inside seams are pressed down. For the next step, we are going to be shirring the cuff. If you've never done this before, the only part that needs to be elastic is the bobbin. So you've got to hand roll this through, as you can't stretch the elastic as you spin it round. So if you let your machine do it, it will be completely wrong. You need to hand wind it and make sure that you don't pull on the elastic as you go through. And then in the top of the machine, you just keep your normal thread that you've been using throughout the rest of this project. Whenever I'm doing shirring, I make sure that I wind about 3 bobbins ahead of time. It just makes it a lot easier for later on. We're doing quite a bit of shirring in this one, so 3, maybe 4 bobbins to start with is a good idea. Starting 0.2 millimeters away from the top stitching you did previously, stitch like you normally would all the way around until you reach the stitching on the other side. We are repeating this process over and over again with a 1 centimeter gap between each row of shirring. You will notice as you go around that the fabric starts to gather together, which is the desired look we want with the elastic. However, you've just got to make sure that the fabric is flat as you stitch it. As you can see here, I'm actually pulling the fabric so it lays nice and flat. You may find that you want to stitch a little bit slower as you get towards the end, as it gets a lot harder to pull the fabric through and to keep it in a straight line. I've sped up this a lot so that you don't have to watch the whole 20 minutes it takes to shear this cuff, but I am actually slowing down the closer I get towards the end. And this is how your shirred cuff should look. Now we have to trim down all of the threads. We don't have to worry about tying them together because we've back stitched at the beginning and end of each piece. To turn it the wrong way round and cut all the inside, you might find in the inside that some of the elastic has been caught in other elements of the shirring. That's okay, don't try pulling it back through, just trim it where it is, and yeah, that will be absolutely fine. And this is how the cuff looks. Now this is the exciting part, you get to see the crop top coming together. Both the sleeves are done and this is how they should look. I always do the sleeves first because they are the hardest, and once that's done you can start to see how everything's going to come together. Now, starting with bodice pieces 5 and 6, we are going to gather the bodice to fit the lining. Firstly, we are going to iron the main fabric piece in half so that we have a nice crease line that we can stitch in, so stitching in the ditch again, and we are going to set our sewing machine to the longest stitch, which is normally 5, and stitch along the centre seam. Remember here not to backstitch at the beginning or end, as we need to use these threads to gather the seam. Now put the main fabric piece to one side, and now we're going to move on to the lining fabric. Here we are going to stitch the darts in place. So fold the markings along where the darts are, so the point on the end marks up to these 2 points here. Iron flat and pin in place. Now we are going to do the same on the other side, and once this is done, everything's pressed nicely and you feel certain that the darts are in the right place, go to the sewing machine and stitch all the way along. Start from the smallest section and make sure you don't backstitch, so you start off and you keep the threads long so that you can tie the threads at the end. Now iron the darts down towards the waistline. For this step, we are taking the main fabric and popping it on top of the lining fabric. Here we are going to use that gathered stitch that we did before the darts. We are going to pull on these threads and make sure it fits perfectly to the lining. Once we've done this, we're going to go to the sewing machine and top stitch along that gathered section. Now use your stitch ripper to pull out any of the gathering stitches. With the right sides together of both the lining and main fabric, pin together the top seams. This is going to be with a 0.5 centimetre seam allowance. Stitch that you have set your machine back to the normal stitch length, which is normally 2.5. And finish off with the overlocker. press the overlocked seam towards the lining side and turn it so the right side is facing up and top stitch in place. Now, to make the bodice lining fit with the main fabric, we need to do a gathering stitch along both sides from here and the same on the other side here, using a 5 stitch again, so the longest stitch that you have. This will help us to gather up the fabric and it will match along the lining edge with the dart attached. Again, remember not to backstitch at the beginning or end of any gathering stitches and keep the threads long. Now use your gathering threads to pull and match the lining to the main fabric. There won't be much that you need to gather here as it's quite a small section. Now make sure you pin all around the gathered edge and the bottom base section, as we will be stitching all of this in place. Stitch the lining and main fabric together all the way around. You can use a large stitch for this, the longest setting 5. This is just so if any of these bits of stitching pop through once everything's sewn together, it's a lot easier to pick out those threads with your seam ripper. Now we are working with pieces 7 and 8. This will make up the bodice base. Pin these sections together and stitch in place with a 1 centimetre seam allowance and overlock the raw edges. Once you have overlocked the edge, press these seams outwards. Now, to finish off the bodice front, we are going to pin the bodice top to the base of the bodice. Use lots of pins for this and start with the middle section. So if you fold in half both sections, you can match the middle and start from there. Stitch the two elements together using a 1 cm seam allowance and overlock the raw edge. Now here's the first look at how the crop top is going to look. This is exciting because you start to see everything forming and coming together. For this section we are using pattern piece 2 and there's 2 of these. We pin each section to the edge of the bodice, matching all the way up and along. We are going to stitch this with a 1 cm seam allowance and finish off by overlocking the raw edge. Here we are starting by working on the shirred section on the back, which is pattern piece 3. Firstly, we need to make a nice elastic holder on the top, which is basically a hem. So fold seam down by 0.5 centimeters, then another 1.2 centimeters. We are going to stitch this seam as close as we can to the edge, so we have about 1 centimeter for the elastic to go through. The back piece will be shirred just like the arm cuff that we did previously, so thread the machine like before with the elastic in the bottom with the hand wound elastic, and in the top use your normal thread. I start around 0.2 centimeters away from the seam we've just stitched for the elastic, and then once we've stitched that one in place we can use the foot to measure 1 centimeter all the way down till around 1.5 centimeters from the base. This section is going to be hemmed with a piece of elastic, so we will leave this bit for later. I always use the foot as my guide for the 1 centimeter allowance. This is so that I don't have to draw all chalk or water erasable pen all the way down. If you feel better marking all the way along, that's absolutely fine. It's just I find the process a lot quicker and easier for me. And remember once again to keep pulling the fabric as you go along so that you are always stitching the shirring on a flat surface. You've got to be very careful with this element because you will find that as you go down, especially on the edges, the fabric can move up and down. If you do this too much, then the bottom will be out of line and it will have a curved edge. So just be aware of this as you're going along. Take time with this. It definitely pays off in the long run. And here you can see I've run out of bobbin again, so I'm just refilling with a spool that I filled earlier. Now trim away all of the thread and elastic from the shirred section. Here we are going to measure the top elastic panel. This measurement is going to be how long our elastic is. We need to add 2 centimetres on to this number for the seam allowance. To thread the elastic through the loop, use a safety pin and attach it to one end of the elastic, and then we are going to ease it through the panel by popping one end inside, holding the end of the elastic to make sure it doesn't pull through, and pull the elastic all the way through. Now secure the ends of the elastic in place with a zigzag stitch. Make sure you back stitch, forward stitch a couple of times to make it extra secure. And make sure that you only stitch in the seam allowance, which is 1 centimetre. Now pin down the shirred back panel to the back bodice pieces. Use a 1 centre seam allowance to stitch this in place, and then overlock the raw edge. Now here we are also going to overlock the hem edge all the way around. Make sure when you're overlocking this edge that the shirred section, you pull it flat like you do with any of your other stitches. Now that we have overlocked the raw edge, we are going to measure the bottom elastic panel. This is the same measurement as the top elastic panel, just don't include the 2cm seam allowance. Now we need to attach the elastic to the bottom of the shirred panel, pin to one end, and we will start stitching from the other end. Make sure that the elastic is very close to the overlocked edge. Now we are going to use a zigzag stitch and attach this all the way along the shirred edge. Here it's quite tricky because you have to pull both the elastic and the shirred section flat. So this amount of elastic here has to be stitched all the way along the shirred edge, so you have to pull the top elastic, holding it at the other end to make sure that there's enough to go all the way along. You can use a pin to measure the middle section. Now press the hem up 1 centimetre. This should be in line with the elastic, so I start with the back panel and continue pressing all the way around. Pin everything in place. I like to match this up at the front so I can make sure that the hem is nice and flat. Now we have to stitch the hem in place using roughly a 0.8 centimetre seam allowance. Between 0.5 and 0.8 we are trying to stitch quite close to the inside hem. So stitch all the way along, and remember when it comes to the shirred section to pull the fabric flat again. For this hem I have stitched with the material facing up. This is just personal preference, so if you want to stitch the hem the other way around, that's absolutely fine, so you can see exactly where the needle's going and you know that none of the hem is rolling under. Press the hem and seams flat. Now we are going to hem the final section of the top bodice. Fold and press down 0.5 centimetres, then a further 1 centimetre. We are going to pin this in place, and when we stitch we are going to match up the elastic panel on the left stitching with this row, so it looks like it's one hem going all the way along. Make sure to match up the stitching here. Here we are attaching the arm sleeve to the bodice. Make sure the fabric is facing right sides together. This is the armhole of the bodice, and here the raw edge is the part that we are attaching to the bodice. Firstly, attach the centre seams. This means that everything else can be eased in place. Then match both of the ends and gather in and ease the rest of the fabric in between the 3 pins. Stitch the sleeve in place with a 1 cm seam allowance. Now finish off the sleeve openings with an overlock stitch. For the final step, we are going to check if there's any basting stitches that are visible, and if there is, get your seam ripper and pick any of these areas out. There might be some around the bust area, around here. Make sure you give your garment a good press. And here is the finished crop top. I hope you love it. I would absolutely love to see your makes, so please tag me on Instagram at blazefaithapparel so I can have a look. Here's a quick glimpse at how it looks with the opaque sheer fabrics. Remember here, there's no layer, second layer on the cuffs, but the rest of the bodice I have double lined the fabric. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed making this top or watching the video along with me, and I hope that you've picked up some tricks and tips on how to sew certain things, or you might have learnt shirring, which is fantastic. I hope you liked it. Please give it a thumbs up if you did, and subscribe for more videos. I will hope to release them on a weekly basis. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.